Okay. Okay, so good morning. So here we are. Let us continue. So we had a number of footnotes to this shtar that we saw before, and I guess maybe what we should do is really go over the footnotes to this shtar. Oh, hi, Joby. Welcome back. Good morning. And welcome back, Dr. Bean. Okay. So the nusach of the shtar that we had talked about last time is Ani so-and-so, I so-and-so, Biyom so-and-so, Lechodesh so-and-so, Shnat so-and-so. You put down the date. Matzir et dilahalan. I hereby declare as follows. And so in the footnote, he says, Matzir et dilahalan, b'chol se'if shebishtar, shenigbar be'emtza hashita. He says, anytime you find a paragraph that finishes in the middle of the line, yesh letayet et yeter hashita. He says, what you should do is you should dash the rest of the line. Dahainu lemaloto b'shurat dio uchai gavna. That you should fill in any blank spaces with ink. Kedei shelo yehe nishar shem makom sham makom chalak ad sof hashita. So that you don't leave any blank spaces in the contract. So that no one can fill in something that would change substantively the nature of the shtar. So we had seen this at the end of our studies of Imrei Yaakov, how it is easy to use a blank space to forge. So that's why, if you notice, he even has in the printed version, right? I hereby declare as follows, and then he's got a bunch of dashed lines to fill in the blank space. So then, im hayorshim sheli lo yivatru al zuchut hayerusha shalahem be'izavoni kidei lekayem et tzava'ati ha'acharona. If my heirs do not forego their rightful inheritance in order to fulfill my last will and testament, meaning I want, let's say, in the case where a guy's got two boys and a girl, if my two sons do not give up their rightful inheritance, let's say to split the estate 50-50, and instead, instead of fulfilling my wishes that my daughter get a third, they insist on taking each 1/2. So then, a moment before my death, I want $100 million of my estate to go to my daughter, right? That was basically the mechanism. So let's take a look at the footnotes again. Im hayorshim sheli lo yivatru, if my heirs do not forego their portion. Hine ikar hahitchayvut shebishtar zehu al tanai shelo yikayemu hayorshim et hatzava'a. He says the whole basis of this shtar hitchayvut, of this promissory note that the person is making out now, is predicated on his heirs not fulfilling the instructions of his will. V'chomosha bi'arnu beperak aleph otei. V'lachein nisachnu hashtar shehiyeh behetem lehilchot tanai hamivuarim b'shulchan aruch even ha'ezer simin lamed ches sif beis. And therefore, we have written our shtar in accord with the Shulchan Aruch and Even HaEzer, which talks about a ketubah. V'hinei ita sham deba'inan sheyeh hahein kodem lalav. That in any kind of legal shtar, which is predicated on a condition, like if you do this, then this, and if you don't do this, then this. So normally the positive has to precede the negative. Uvelo zeh kayam hama'aseh afilu im hatanai lo nitkayem. He says, and if you don't write it in that format, then even without the fulfillment of the condition, the obligation is still binding. In other words, you could malform a shtar in such a way that if it's not written accurately, then the contract will be binding even when the condition is not met. So he says, don't therefore ask the question on what I have written, which is basically, if my heirs do not fulfill my wishes. He says, Shekafi hanira halav kodem lehahein. He says, here we've put the negative in front of the positive. If my heirs do not fulfill my wishes, then, in other words, how does he write it? He says, Im hayorshim shali lo yavatru al zchut hayerusha. If my heirs do not fulfill the wishes of my will and testament. Okay, so he explains. He says, the Mishnah Lamelech, the Hilchot Isha nistapakti b'mi hela dedina dehein kodem lalav choser hu al hamaisa velo al hatanai. He says that which we say that the negative has to precede the positive is only in regard to the action that is being executed in the contract, which means that I want my daughter, in this case, I want my daughter to get $100 million. Okay? Rod Salomer, shetchilat tzarich lefaresh hatzad shel kiyum ha'ma'aseh, ve'achar kach yifaresh hatzad shel bitulo. First you say, this is what it'll take for this shtar to be consummated. And this is what it'll take for the shtar to not to be consummated. So therefore, essentially what you're doing is that if my heirs do not fulfill the wishes of my will, then this contract shall be consummated, meaning that my daughter will get $100 million, which is, therefore, you are putting the positive before the negative. I hope I'm making myself clear. You are putting the positive before the negative because you're saying this is what it will take for this contract to be consummated if my heirs do not fulfill my wishes. So even though that's formulated in the negative, the positive on the execution of the contract. Okay? And if they do fulfill my wishes, then the contract will not be executed. That's the negative. Okay? But we don't care if the condition is a negative, right? Uchagon shetziyer shama mishnah lamelech shehitna imlo e'ele le'eretz Yisrael hareini noten lecha matana ayin sham. The example that's brought in the Mishnah Lamelech in that discussion in Halacha is a person makes the following statement. He says, if I don't make aliyah, then I'm hereby giving you a gift of such and such. The imkain who had, and therefore, even though the conditional clause is written in the negative, but the action is written in the positive, and that's what has to come first. Kain hu adin bahadidan tzarich lefaresh tchila hatzad shel kiyum ha'ma'aseh dahainu chalot ha'hitchayvut shelo af shehu mutne b'inyan shlishi shel heder kiyum hatzava'ah v'chiagav mechashiv shapir hin kodem lalav kenal. And therefore, in this kind of scenario, you are putting the positive before the negative as far as the execution, even though the condition is putting the negative before the positive. Okay? So that's just a technical point. And then he writes, Im hayorshim shali lo yavatru, if my heirs do not forego their portion and do not fulfill the wishes of my will, then I hereby obligate myself from this moment forward, such that a moment before I die, $100 million of my estate will go to my daughter. And he says, the conditional statement must always precede the execution or that which will take place. So you say if, and then it's an if-then statement. The if has to precede the then. And that's how every contract has to work. Okay, let's go back to the text. Then he says, "Kedei lakayim tzavati v'yimchol hazocha b'shtar hitchayvut zeh et zuchuto hazeh klapei otam hayorshim Hamevatrim al zuchut hayerusha shelahem. He says what he was talking about. He says, "Im miksat hayorshim sheli lo yevatru al zuchut hayerusha shelahem be'izvoni." He says, if a percentage of my heirs do not wish to forego their portion and do not wish to honor the wishes of my will, kidei lekayem et tzavati, umiksat hayorshim sheli yevatru al zuchut hayerusha shelahem kidei lekayem et tzavati, and a portion of my heirs are willing to forego, the yimchol hazoche bishtar hitchayvutze et zuchuto hazeh klapei otam hayorshim hamevatrim al zuchut hayerusha shelahem. Basically, he's saying that my daughter, who's going to receive the $100 million, will forgive her portion to those heirs that are willing to fulfill the wishes of my will. That's essentially what he's saying. So if we look in Daled, in the footnote, he says, Atam lazeh, di'im lokein, he says, the reason why I've included this clause is because if you don't include this clause, nimsa shagam oto yoresh shemirutze b'kiyum hatzava'a, mitchayev kefi chelko beha'izavon b'itchayvuto shel shtar zeh. He says, why should he be penalized? In other words, I guess what Rav Cohen is essentially saying is, let's say a guy has 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and one of the sons wants to cooperate and wants to fulfill his father's wishes. The other son says, nothing doing. I'm entitled to 50% of the estate. So what the man is essentially saying in this contract, what the testator is saying is, in the event that a portion of my heirs are willing to fulfill my will, and only one portion is not willing to fulfill my will, then the person who I have named to receive the $100 million gift, namely my daughter, shall forgive her $100 million gift to the heir who is willing to fulfill my wishes. And in that way, you're not penalizing the good boy. You're only penalizing the bad boy. V'lachein hutna shelo tachol ha'yitchayvut ela im kein yimchol ha'yoresh hahu et chelko b'yitchayvut hahi. And so therefore the condition is so that this gift of 100 million shall not take place unless that she has to, the recipient of the gift has to forgive her portion to the heir who's willing to cooperate. Because essentially what will happen is that he'll get basically, he's basically saying, let's say my estate is worth $1 million and I've promised $100 million to my daughter. So she has to leave $500,000 in the estate for her brother, who's willing to cooperate, and the other $500,000 will go to her. So, and that'll basically cut out the third child who wasn't willing to cooperate. Because the boy wasn't willing to cooperate. So we're going to penalize him. That's right. But that's only if everyone's cooperating. If this guy's going to contest my will, then he gets nothing. The son who contests my will gets nothing. Right? That's essential. That's right. Right.
How would that happen?
It could also be so שגם אותו יורשים רצונו בקיום הזמן בהתחייב כפי חלקו בעיזבון בהתחייבות של שלום. ולכן נתנה שלא תחול ההתחייבות, אלא אם כן ימחול היורש ההוא את חלקו בהתחייבות ההיא. It could be that he's saying that maybe that Yoresh will only get a third. I'm not sure. But then that also won't work, because why would the daughter get 2/3? So you're cutting out the heir who doesn't want to cooperate.
silence. There's going to be a period of time. So that property's going to have a lien. So if the lien says, well, there's nothing going to you, that's it, you're out, then there's no problem to put a lien on this property. You understand what I'm saying?
No. Look, as soon as I make this, as soon as I sign this document, my entire estate has a lien on it to my daughter. But it's a conditional lien. It's a conditional lien that will only be determined upon my death if my will is not followed, right? So if my will, of course it doesn't make sense. And that's why he'll abide by it, right? So it's only a conditional lien. So if the heirs choose to abide by the terms of the will, then retroactively there was never a lien. The lien disappears. That's right. Okay. V'umikra shehayorshim sheli yamutu kodem chiluk ha'izavon, az yasubu kol hatanayim ha'ma'orim b'shtar zel yorshim shelahem or yorsha yorshahem v'chula. And then you add a clause that says, and if, God forbid, my heirs predecease me, so then I want the conditions of this contract to apply to their heirs, to my heirs' heirs, etc., etc., etc. And of course, if the person that you've named as the recipient of the $100 million gift passes away, you'd have to completely redraft this document, right? Let's just see footnote A. Okay. Ulai me'ikar hadin ein tzarich lefarish kein laheja demuvan hi me'elav mimashmos hashtar. He says it's possible that this does not need to be explicated, doesn't have to be written explicitly, because it could be that that's implicit in this document. Shahatanoim yasubu al osam sha'omdim lirash hanechasim b'shas chiluk ha'izavon. Because whatever conditions applied to the heirs will apply to their heirs. V'chein mashma me'anach l'shiva b'simcha balach v'nesachshar chatzi zachar shelo hizker klum me'yorsha yorsha v'mikol makom l'ravcha demilsa parat nukein lahedja v'nesach hashtar. So even though other svarim do not include this clause of my heirs' heirs, nonetheless I put it in just to, just for extra oomph. Yeah, you can name whoever you want the recipient of the 100 million to be. You can name whoever you want. You can name the man in the moon. Whoever, like you can name a friend, you can name an acquaintance. You can name a grandchild, right? And I think a lot of times parents do that. In other words, they'll say, if there's any dispute among my children about the estate, and I immediately want the estate to be transferred to my grandchildren instead. Yeah. But this is a way of actually formalizing this according to halacha. You're skipping a generation. It's not, well, are you allowed to do it? So there is this issue in halacha, and we saw this actually in the Imrei Yaakov when we learned about in the very first sif. I don't think you were with us when we were learning. It was either the first or second sif when we were learning the laws about trusts and wills. It had said that a testator should not cut a child out of the will, even if the child is not nohei kashur, even if the child is not behaving correctly. I'll try and find it, and we'll go over that halacha again. It says you're not supposed to do it. Why? Because even though the son may not be behaving properly, perhaps his descendants will, and you shouldn't deprive your descendants of their rightful, inheritance. Let's say, my son has become a ne'er-do-well and has, become a scoundrel of a person. He ended up in jail and for who knows what, and I want to cut him out of my estate. So it's the halacha still states you should try to avoid cutting him out entirely, because who knows, maybe his kids will grow up and be a source of nachas. So what you're suggesting, Moshe, is, well, then why not just cut him out of the estate entirely and pass it on to the children? The reasoning is sound. The reasoning would be that, okay, at least I'm not cutting out my grandchildren, so maybe that would be okay. I'm not sure. But you'd have to have a very good reason. You'd have to have a solid reason to cut children out of an estate. There are also situations where, your children, let's say, are financially very, very stable, and you want to make sure that their kids have the benefit of your estate. That's perfectly reasonable also. Yeah, bottom line is that what we've been seeing is that a person does have a right to reapportion his estate such that some of his descendants who would normally not be entitled to inherit are able to get a portion. We'll take a look at that language in the Rav Shulchan Aruch another time. Okay, so then we continue along this contract, and it says, "Az hareini mitchayev me'achshav sach," and so therefore, I hereby obligate the sum of, excuse me, X number of dollars, le, to so and so. And he writes in the footnote, Yesh lichtov b'makom hachalak et Hashem shel echad me'ipotropsei ha'izavon. You should fill in the name of one of the executors of your estate. Uvetanai she'oto apitropus yiyeh shelo mibnei mishpachat hamitzaveh. And you should fill in other words, instead of leaving it to your daughter, you should basically assign your entire estate to the executor of your estate. He should not be from the family. V'gam she'oto apotropos yiyeh Yehudi. And he should also be a Jew. V'mikre she'af echad min ha'ipotropsim eno mimali shnei tanoim halalu. As yesh lichtov b'makom hachalak shemo shel rav echad she'enu mibnei mishpachat hamitzaveh. He says, and if you cannot find someone who fulfills both of those criteria, that he's not from your family and that he's a yid, then you should write in the name of a rabbi. Yes, please fill in my name, so I will become the executor and the right. Or so that he cannot be from the family. And we'll explain the reason why in Sifkat and Vav, which we're going to see right now. So when it comes into filling the name of the person who's going to receive the $100 million gift, so he writes as follows. He says, "V'yichtov b'makom hachalak et Hashem shel echad me'apotropsei ha'izavon." Hashem shel Rav echad Moshe katafti beha'ara. He says you fill in the name of either the executor of your estate, like your lawyer or one of your executors, or it should be the name of your Rav. V'hatam shehitzrachni l'sayim et shemo shel ha'ish hamitchayev lo v'lo sagi lichtov rak shemitchayev lazeh shehi apotropos ha'izavon. He says the reason why I feel it's important to identify the name of that person that you're obligating yourself to, and it's not good enough just to write, I hereby gift $100 million to the executor of my estate. That's not sufficient. You have to actually write a specific name of a human being. He says, Mishum denira dehecha de losiyim lemihu mishtabed v'talui birur ha'inyan beha'atid. He says, because if you don't write the name of a specific individual and you say that I hereby leave this gift to the executor of my estate, and that's not something that's been determined yet, then the problem that you run into is banu leplukta de rabvasa imahani shibud kihai gavna. He says there's a big machlokes whether such an obligation of a gift even applies, because it's a gemara in Gittin. The Omar Shab, the time of the Maimon Shloshtem Tekana, Dehu mishum denase kaomer lo v'lamalva b'shas matamos shibadnu l'chad l'didach l'chol da'atu machmatach. He says, a person can consummate a debt, in other words, can generate a debt if he is standing in front of a lender and he basically says in the presence of three people, I hereby subjugate to you, let's say $1,000 to you and anyone who will come in your stead with the rights of collection. In other words, your creditors will also be able to collect from me this amount. The Katav Allah Haran b'Shem Haramban, the Shibud Kihai, Afilu Yefarish Kain Lahedja Bishtaro du Mishabit Atzma L'chol Mahanadaate Machmate Lo Mahani Midir Oraisa. He says, normally, if you would write this in a shtar, says the Ran, that this would not help. In other words, I can't create a nebulous debt. I can't create a nebulous subjugation to someone who is an unnamed person. Doesn't work midioraisa. Mishum de'ein breira. V'lo amrinan huvera hadavar lemafreya denishtabed b'shas matamos lazeh da'ati machmatei batarach. He says, biblically, this doesn't work. I can't, in other words, let's say a creditor comes to me and says, I don't know if I'm going to be alive when the debt is due. So I will designate someone else that you can pay the debt to if I'm not around to collect it. Well, so what's the guy's name? I don't know. I haven't decided yet. But whoever I assign, he'll be able to collect the debt in my stead. That doesn't work biblically because you cannot designate someone, you cannot create a financial obligation to someone who hasn't yet been chosen, hasn't yet been selected. That's the point that he's making. It only works rabbinically. It does not work biblically. V'nira delefize bahadidan lo mahani af lebater takanta de rabbanan de lo tiknu kain ela belava mos mechavero. He says, and the rabbis only made this accommodation that you can be obligated to pay someone who has not yet been identified as a creditor only when it comes to a loan. In a case of a loan, the rabbis made a special accommodation to people who wish to lend money to their friends that we will allow you to name a creditor in your stead after the fact, and the debtor will be obligated to pay that creditor who was only named after the fact in order to allow you, make it easier for you to lend money. He says, but in our situation, it doesn't even work rabbinically because you're generating a gift. You're not creating, this is not a loan situation. He says, the Ran, however, himself disagrees, and he holds that a person can generate a debt to an unnamed, as of yet, individual. Nonetheless, and therefore, according to the Ran, you could say generically, I hereby designate my executor, and you don't put in his name because maybe you're going to change executors, then it would work. Mikol makom nira shekotev shtar zem matzitoin kimli keharamban velo chayil shibuda. But the whole issue here is that you want to protect your will. And what if one of your sons is a Talmud Chacham, and he says, he gave the gift to his unnamed executor, that guy didn't exist. I paskin like the Ramban. I don't paskin like the Ran. Remember, we saw this in the Imrei Yaakov plenty of times. Whenever there's a machlokes, the burden of proof is on the person who is not the muchzak, is not the holding on to the money. The heir could argue, I'm the muchzak. I've got the money. The money is mine already because as soon as my father died, the estate fell to me. And he therefore wants to say, I don't paskin like that, Ron. He says, and therefore it seems to me that you have to actually fill in the name of the person receiving the gift. And it should be someone that it should be to the executor. Now, the question that he's going to ask is, why did I say that you have to name the executor? Why not just name one of your children who's not an heir, like your daughter? So we'll see that tomorrow. He's going to explain that principle to us tomorrow. Okay, we'll hold it here.